Predictions of the future come in all kinds of flavors, from sustainable solarpunk utopias to industrial cyberpunk dystopias. Whether you believe in one or the other probably says a lot more about you and your own level of optimism. But we do know the future will be different in a lot of ways. I mean, just think about how much the world has changed in the last 20 years. How much our lives have changed in the last 20 years. Well, what if we projected that out for another 80 years to the end of the century? What will the world be like in 2100? This is impossible to know, obviously. I mean, just predicting 5 years out at this point is a fool's errand. So imagine the kind of fool who wants to look ahead 80 years. Me, I'm this fool. But along the way, we'll take a look back at some of the predictions of today from the past and see what we can learn from what they got wrong, what they got right, and just apply that going forward. We really did our best when looking at this to kind of take our own biases out of it and just kind of look at the facts, look at the long-term trends while considering the social and economic factors at play. This is meant to be a realistic take. Not good or bad, just, playing the odds. So let's time travel to the year 2100 and see exactly what things might look like at the end of this century. So before we look into the future, let's look into the past and see what they predicted about the world of today. So the place where I wanted to start was I wanted to see if I could find the oldest possible prediction of the year 2000. Seemed like a nice round number. It's the end of the millennium. I thought surely people were thinking about the year 2000 going back, hundreds of years and making predictions way back then, but I think I was wrong. My writer Jason and I, we looked all over for some future predictions that, came from like hundreds of years ago, but we really couldn't find much before around the mid-1800s. Now, if anybody in the comments knows about something that I missed, please by all means share it because I'm super curious, but we couldn't find anything. Yeah, we couldn't find any writings from any scientists that specifically predicted anything about the year 2000. I thought for sure that there would be some literature that, had novels that were set in the far future, but it turns out sci-fi as a genre pretty much didn't exist until the early 1800s. So many people consider Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to be the first science fiction novel. That came out in 1830. Now, whether or not that qualifies as the first sci-fi novel is up for debate, and a lively one. You guys have at it down below if you want. But the point is, before the mid-1800s, people didn't really think about the future in those terms. They didn't think of the future as a drastically different place where people lived drastically different lives using technology we couldn't even imagine. And again, I am going to make the argument that the world probably changed more in the 1800s than at any other time in human history, because at the beginning of the 1800s, people were living, for the most part, the way they had for hundreds of years prior. But by 1900, people were driving cars, making phone calls, working alongside giant machines and huge factories. I mean, if you think about it, it's no surprise that this is when science fiction showed up for the first time, because for the first time, people could see technological change happening right before their eyes, and then project that progress forward and imagine a different world in the future. And one of the earliest science fiction authors to do that was Jules Verne. Jules Verne was a 19th century author whose famous classic novels include Around the World in 80 Days, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But he also wrote a book in 1863 that went unpublished. It was his second book, and the publisher refused to print it because they felt it was too grim. It would later get rediscovered and published, but that didn't happen until 1994. It's called Paris in the 20th Century, and as the name suggests, it's set in Paris in the year 1960, so he was thinking 100 years out. And get this, it's eerily accurate. For example, it includes things like the expansion of suburban living, synthesizer-based electronic music with a record industry to sell it, skyscrapers illuminated at night, gas-powered cars along with filling stations and asphalt roads, advanced forms of public transit like subways and elevated trains, fax machines, a basic internet-like system, and career women. #feminist. Now, obviously not all of that was around in 1963, but, we eventually got there. So how did he manage to get so many things right? It wasn't because he had some prophetic vision of the future or anything. He was basically just a nerd. He read scientific publications and he kept up with technological developments, and then he would infer applications of those discoveries and extrapolate from there. That sounds like old Verne was one of our people.
Hey, Verne!
But even his story was set in 1960. It didn't quite get to the year 2000. I really couldn't find a whole lot of 2000 predictions before the year 1900, but there were a lot that popped up in 1900. And that makes sense, they just crossed over into a new century, and the last century saw so much change. Of course, they were thinking about where things would go from there. But many of them weren't as analytical as Jules Verne was. For example, in 1900, the Ladies' Home Journal published 28 predictions for the year 2000, And some of these predictions include, there will be no wild animals and rats and mice will have been exterminated. R.I.P. Pizza Rat. Everyone will walk 10 miles a day, and if you can't walk 10 miles, you'd be considered a weakling. And they predicted the letters C, X, and Q would disappear from our alphabet because they'll become unnecessary. The magazine did get some things right, like ready-cooked meals would be widely available, telephones all around the world, and hot and cold air from spigots. It also said that university education would be free for every woman and man, so we kind of went the other way with that one. Other predictions envisioned everything from dissolvable dishes to clothes made out of aluminum to car shoes. There's also the hope that diseases are cured or eradicated. People were generally optimistic about future humans being way healthier. Like another interesting thing from that Ladies' Home Journal article, it said that Americans would be 2 inches taller, and because of better living in the suburbs, they would live to 50 instead of 35. And I had to go back and check that, but yeah, that's what they said. I'm pretty sure people were living past 35 in 1900, so I don't know what that was about. Across the pond in 1900, a German chocolate company called Hildebrands commissioned a set of postcards depicting the year 2000. They put these postcards in with their chocolate bars as a little extra something, but these predicted people traveling in personal airships, giant roofs over cities, and weather-changing machines. But it also predicted being able to watch a theater performance from somewhere else, moving sidewalks, and mobile homes. So their versions of it were different from how they actually came out, but still. There's also the set of postcards commissioned for the Paris World Fair that depicted life in the year 2000. They're created by Jean-Marc Coté, and eventually 87 of them would be made, predicting a lot of flying, underwater travel on a whale bus, and kids at school just getting the info zapped into their brain. Now these are easy to laugh at now, but it kind of reflects where things were going for them. You know, they saw increased automation, flying advancements happening right about that time, and they just started looking at what things would look like if we had actually figured that out. There are also a lot of predictions from various places about traveling and living underwater. I don't know. I just found that interesting. Like they thought that that's the next like place that we would explore into, which we did, but not on like a residential level. Now jumping ahead to 1964, the New York Times ran a story with prediction about the year 2000, and one of the sections talks about the future problem of leisure. The paper wrote, quote, "We may not anticipate the emergence of a leisure class, but we may with assurance anticipate the coming of the day when almost everyone enjoys, or groans under, the possession of leisure." It's kind of a bizarre article. It questioned what Americans would do if they could only work 25 or 30 hours a week, or if they weren't allowed to work until they were 21, and what if they had to retire at 50? The horror! Although recently there has been a lot of talk about 4-day work weeks in some companies and in some places, so I don't know, maybe we're getting there. But a lot of past predictions thought that we'd be way healthier than we are today. Many of them almost made us sound like super beings with incredible strength that never age. And while if you look at bodybuilders from 1900 and 2000, you can see we've definitely pushed the boundaries of human performance, but where they had underconsumption most of the time, we have overconsumption and all the health issues that come along with that. Also in 1966, the BBC interviewed a bunch of kids and teenagers to see what they thought the world would be like in the year 2000.
Some madman will get the atomic bomb and just blow the world into oblivion. All these atomic bombs will be dropping around the place.
So there's nothing you can do to stop it. More people will get bombs.
It'll be so overpopulated that there'll all be wars. All the nuclear explosions and everything. It'll make the Earth, too much radiation on it. It'll become too hot to live on. I think that there'll be no life at all, really, on the Earth.
I'm not looking forward to living in that year, about 50 years' time. I mean, the world seems to be in such a terrible state now, let alone in 50 years' time.
Yeah. Clearly the Zoomers aren't the first generation to have an existential threat hanging over their heads. But this kind of brings us to the overall point, which is that predictions about the future really are more about the time that they're made than they are about the future itself. Like this prediction of the year 2000 in 1997.
After retiring from the White House, President Clinton requests and is granted an appointment to a newly formed position in the Department of Health. His title, National Breast and Fried Food Inspector.
That didn't happen? No, that didn't happen. But when I say that predictions are usually more about the time when they were made, like you can look at the 1950s, everything was about atomic energy in the 50s. It was the atomic age. So when they predicted the future, they saw everything being run by atomic energy. Southland magazine even wrote an article predicting about how crops would grow taller thanks to the positive effects of the H-bomb. In it, a fictionalized farmer said, quote, "You'd be surprised what that bombing did for the soil. Things grow like crazy, and the robot doesn't mind a bit sowing the seeds and keeping the place up. H-bombs and robots, what more could you want? Of course, now the only people who fear H-bombs are YouTubers who plagiarize. Also in the 1960s, computers and space travel predictions were popular. Arthur C. Clarke even predicted remote working. In a video from 1964, he said that in the year 2000, men will no longer commute, they'll communicate.
These things will make possible a world in which we can be in instant contact with each other, wherever we may be, where we can contact our friends anywhere on Earth, even if we don't know their actual physical location. It will be possible in that age, perhaps only 50 years from now, for a man to conduct his business from Tahiti or Bali just as well as he could from London.
I mean, not too shabby. So, just like Arthur C. Clarke and Jules Verne, I'm going to do my best to not get swept up in what's trendy today, but to look at trends over the last few decades and then, extrapolate out from that. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come up with something reasonably accurate. And if I'm wrong, and in the year 2100 they look back at this and I look ridiculous, then I guess at least I won't be around for them to make fun of me. Unless something really crazy happens. Okay, so I've broken these down into different lenses that kind of reflect the things that will affect the way we live in the future, or the people that follow us will live in the future. You guys can feel free to agree or disagree down in the comments. Please do chime in. I think there'll be an interesting conversation around this, but let's get started with communications. Like, what does the internet look like in the year 2100? Especially considering how much change we've seen in just the last 30 years. It's insane when you think about it. Like, to the point that I ran across this TikTok the other day.
Okay, this is a genuine question to older people. What did you do before you could look something up? Like, if you saw someone and you were like, oh, they remind me of that actor, what was that, what's his name? And okay, without Google Maps, I know that there was MapQuest, but before that, genuinely, what would you do? Would you just accept not knowing?
Now, I'm not sharing that clip to make fun of this creator or stir up generational hate or anything like that. The reason I'm bringing it up is because I catch myself thinking that sometimes. How did we live without smartphones? And I was there. I grew up without the internet. The fact that the internet has gone in only 20 years from being this thing that's just kind of on your computer that you just check every once in a while, or that you do work on, to this thing that is in your pocket every minute of every day, providing you with all the information available in human history at all times. Literally so integrated into every aspect of our lives that we seriously don't know how we used to exist without it. I think it's safe to assume that the trend is toward more immersion. Now, in the immediate future, as I've talked about before, I think this leads to things like more virtual and augmented reality through things like smart glasses. But there's also another kind of immersion that we've seen with the internet, and that's an immersion of opinions and perspectives. I mean, that's kind of what the internet is. It's like a giant superorganism of people, each with their own views on the world, which we're sharing more and more all the time. We found an article on a website called Future Business Tech, which they've got a YouTube channel, you can go check it out if you want, but they envision that the internet of the future could be basically a global hive mind, where every human thought and every human feeling is available to access 24/7. Also, one where you could construct your own virtual reality just based off of your brain data. Imagine the way personalized ads work now. Well, in the future, you might be able to build personalized realities. As if we weren't fractured enough already. Although, it could allow for more deeper understanding of other people, because if you were able to actually tap into another person's emotions and actually feel what that other person is feeling, it might make you more empathetic toward that person. We have that phrase, always remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you don't know about. And that's an important piece of wisdom that we should all keep in mind. But what if you didn't have to keep it in mind? Because you could feel it for yourself. Of course, the downside there is that some people are lunatics, and some of the things people feel is hatred. So this might be something that might make it easier to spread hate, and it will be used that way. Of course, if we have the ability to, download emotions and thoughts, we'd probably also be able to download skills and knowledge just directly into the brain.
I know Kung Fu.
They might look back at smartphones the way we look at the telegraph now. Yeah, people were able to communicate, but it was really clunky and weird. They might be like, how did anybody ever understand each other if you couldn't just telepathically share your thoughts with them? Now, of course, all of those scenarios are only possible if we're able to figure out how to directly interface with the brain. And I know what you're thinking, but I actually don't think it's going to be Neuralink. I'm not trying to be anti-Neuralink. I actually defend Neuralink. I think it could be a game changer for disabled people to give them accessibility, but I don't think it's going to be embraced by the general public. Not if a non-invasive interface comes along, which I think AI could make possible. So like, scientists have been able to read brain waves for decades, and we've learned a lot of things, like generally about the brain and the different parts of the brain and how they work and whatnot. The problem is we've never been able to actually like discern thoughts or memories or anything like that because there's just way too much noise in the signal. But AI, with its infinitely better pattern recognition, could do just that. And this isn't just me making some prediction about the future, they're doing that right now. This was in an article that came out last March in the journal Science. In the article, they talk about a team in Japan who trained an AI on 4 patients' brain scans and then showed them images like a clock tower or a teddy bear or a train. And then the AI was able to figure out what they were looking at and recreate it with stunning accuracy. Now, granted, they had to do like hundreds of fMRI scans, and the images were created with stable diffusion, so it's really more of an approximation that probably got it wrong more than it got it right. Of course, we're seeing the ones that it got right, but still. With AI being able to read through the noise, it's possible we might actually just have a cap that we can just wear that'll be able to read what's going on inside our heads. But with targeted transcranial stimulation, maybe actually be able to input images and sounds, memories, feelings. Like if we could do that non-invasively, I think that will take off far more than a brain implant. I mean, again, unless we're talking about a disability. But you might be saying, then we'd all have to wear a cap all the time, and nobody's going to want to do that. I think you're wrong. When you look at it, we are actually living in a very hatless time compared to the rest of history. It's kind of weird, actually. It's been the norm to wear hats far more than it has been the norm not to. So yeah, I could see it coming back into fashion. Especially if it gives you access to the all-encompassing global hive mind that you need to survive. It would be different. All right, let's talk about transportation, and I'm going to start with a very bold prediction. No flying cars. I'm sorry, I've been hearing that my whole life, and we're still no closer to it than we've ever been before, so I'm calling it. It's dead. No flying cars. And by that I mean like cars that you would pull out of your driveway or your garage, and one way or another it takes off into the sky. I don't see that. Now I can't imagine, personal drones, little air taxis that everybody could fly around point to point, almost like the way rich people have chartered helicopters today. But everyone's personal flying car, yeah, I don't think it's happening. Nor do I think that there's going to be flying vehicles that are powered by some kind of fantastical hover technology like you see in, Back to the Future Part 2 or The Fifth Element or Star Wars for that matter. That would require the discovery of some kind of new exotic form of energy or gravity manipulation, something that we can't even fathom right now. Now, that discovery might be made in the next 80 years, but implementing it to the point that everybody's flying around on hoverboards, no, I maybe in the far future, but I don't see it happening this century. Which sucks, I know, like the whole, levitating flying car thing is such a sci-fi convention. Like, I feel like we'll eventually figure it out just because we love the idea so much. And if we were talking about the year 2200, maybe. But I do think cars will still be the predominant form of transportation. But in 2100, most of them will be electric. Like fuel-burning cars will be a niche item at that point. Is somebody in the year 2100 going to want to drive a 1972 Plymouth Barracuda? Yes, of course somebody's going to want to drive that. It's a badass car. But I imagine electric cars will be cheaper in every way by then. Cheaper to buy, cheaper to own, cheaper to maintain. It'll probably get over 1,000 miles on a charge with solid-state batteries. And there'll probably be extra taxes levied on, like fossil fuel use. And while I really do want more walkable cities and mass transit, I think in the US anyway, we're still going to be stuck on cars in the year 2100. I do think autonomous cars are eventually going to be a thing. I think it's going to take way longer than we want it to, but I think the economic forces behind it will make it happen. I know when I'm talking about transportation, different parts of the world have very different transportation modalities and everything, so this is a very US-centric thing that I'm talking about here. And in the US specifically, cars are just such a big part of our identity. I just don't see them fully going away. I think for a lot of us here in the US, cars are really more of an expression of freedom. If you don't have a car, you gotta wait on a cab or a bus or a train. With a car, you wait for nobody. You can go anywhere you want at any time. And I think for most Americans, that's pretty important. Not to mention we kind of treat our cars like mini homes, like we keep things in there, we eat in them, sneak away and take naps in them sometimes. But I do think with automation that, cab rides will be so cheap and ubiquitous that a lot more people might actually go the non-car route. you know, and I know this might sound a little crazy, but maybe it might actually help spur on more high-speed rail between cities? Because like the biggest problem with rail, they always say, is the last mile problem. Well, if you have a fleet of robo-taxis that can get you from the station to your home, you might decide you don't need a car after all. And there are several high-speed rail projects in the works right now in the US. One of them is actually right here in Texas to connect Dallas to Houston. It's been very slow going, but it is still going, so that's something. So I think that by the year 2100, cars will be almost entirely electric and autonomous, which might lead to less car ownership, but I still think it'll be the dominant form of transportation. I think air taxis will be a thing, but it won't take over the skies, and planes, well, planes could go in a couple of different directions. So I've covered this before. Planes are particularly difficult to electrify because the batteries are heavy, and normal planes lose mass along the way because they're burning jet fuel. This makes them more efficient. So if planes are going to be electrified, there's a couple of different ways it could go. One is that we might go to smaller planes that carry smaller amounts of passengers, but they're designed for efficiency, like the Solera 500L. I did a video on that a while back. By the way, at the end of this last year, they announced the Solera 800 that they're developing, and it looks like it's supersonic and super laminar. Well, consider me super interested. By the way, for the reasons I just mentioned, I could actually see hydrogen or maybe even ammonia being good fuel sources for electric aviation because they would lose that mass throughout the flight as they use up the fuel. Might be better than batteries because the batteries don't get lighter as the electricity comes out of them. So yeah, airplanes could go that way, you know, a whole lot more of them, but they're a lot smaller, a lot greener. That would have its own drawbacks though. Like it would overtax our already overtaxed air traffic controllers. It would need more infrastructure to handle more planes. More planes landing on runways means more runway repair, not to even mention pilots. Honestly, these planes would have to be autonomous. There's just no way we'd have enough pilots for all of them. But anyway, that's one way that it could go. The other way is that planes might stay basically the same as they are right now, but just be much more efficient. Like maybe still using jet fuel, but with hybrid electric engines. There were actually two big announcements in 2023, one from MIT and one from a company called Duxion, that both claim to have built electric jet engines. So yeah, maybe by 2100 we'll have figured out how to run these planes on hybrid electric engines and net zero carbon fuel, like possibly made from recaptured carbon from the atmosphere. Now, in a Popular Mechanics article from 2018, they made some predictions about the future of transportation. They predicted autonomous cars and trucks and said it would lead to less traffic and fewer accidents. They suggested that most goods will be delivered by drones or pneumatic tubes. I don't know about that. They also said there might be fewer goods going around in general because we'd be able to 3D print whatever we wanted. And I don't know how I feel about that one. I mean, to be honest, I really thought that 3D printing would have become a lot more popular by now. And the fact that it's not, it's more like just ubiquitous makes me wonder if there's something, I don't know, maybe inherent about the way we currently shop for things that might not ever go away. I don't know. What do you think? Now, this article did mention the possibility of flying cars, but it thought that the future would mostly lean toward autonomous cars, though they suggested that autonomous personal drones flying people around might be commonplace. After all, we're kind of already there with airplanes. As Flying Magazine's Stephen Polk told Popular Mechanics, quote, "Creating future autonomous aircraft is actually much easier than doing autonomous cars because there's less of a worry of running into anything in the sky. Eventually, we'll get to the point where pilots aren't needed at all." Now, another future transportation option that you may be thinking about is the whole point-to-point travel with the SpaceX Starship, the way they announced that they would do that. And, I don't know. I don't see it. I mean, all of these launch and land sites would have to be really far away from cities for noise reasons. So by the time you travel to the site and endure security and all that, you might not be saving that much time, unless it's like an other side of the world thing. And I don't know if that's a big enough market to support it. I don't know. I think it'll be technically feasible, and I think someone will try it, somebody else, if not, SpaceX, but I feel like it's going to kind of go the way of the Concorde, like something that we can do, but just never quite got right, the economics never worked out, Not by 2100 anyway. I know there will be many naysayers on this. Nay away in the comments down below. But that is a good segue to the next lens that we can look at 2100 through, and that's space travel. So according to Interesting Engineering, low Earth orbit habitats may be common, writing, quote, "These habits will consist of pinwheel stations, O'Neill cylinders, or both. They will rotate to provide artificial gravity, have functioning biomes that act as regenerative life support systems, and accommodate tourists, research facilities, workers, and residents." Okay, I do think that traveling to space is going to be fairly commonplace by the year 2100. I think there's going to be multiple destinations for people to go to, like space hotels. I think there'll be multiple space labs and microgravity manufacturing facilities in space. And maybe, some kind of spinning artificial gravity space station kind of thing. But things like O'Neill cylinders and like people permanently residing in space, yeah, I'm more shaky on that one. Like, if I'm being honest, I think my own criteria kind of breaks down on this, because if you look back at the long-term trends, there's only been a handful of space stations in the last 50 years. Most of them have been really small, like Skylab, Salyut, Mir, those kinds of things. But that is quickly changing. When China sent Tiangong up in 2021, for the first time, we had 2 long-term space stations in orbit at once. And last year, in 2023, we actually had the most people ever in space at the same time, at 17 people between the 2 space stations. Although actually, technically, the most number of people that have been in space at once is 19. And it only lasted for a few minutes. It was on December 11th, 2021, when there were 10 people on ISS, 3 people on Tiangong, and then Blue Origin put 6 people above the Kármán line in the New Shepard. For a few minutes. Shut up, it counts. And on top of the 2, count them, 2 stations that we currently have up in space, there's multiple private space stations and labs in development from people like Axiom Space, Orbital Reef, which is Blue Origin and Sierra Space, Starlab, which is Lockheed Martin and NanoRacks, and India's building their own space station. Not to mention Lunar Gateway, which is technically a space station around the moon, and then you have people like Above Space with their Prometheus project that's kind of under the radar right now. And there's other more like pie-in-the-sky concepts, but the fact is, with massive reusable rockets like Starship and New Glenn, even Neutron on the horizon, the cost of putting massive space station modules in orbit will become a lot more feasible. I imagine by the 2040s, we'll think nothing at all of there being 7 or 8 space stations in orbit, 30 or 40 people in space at a time, but space tourism at that point I think will still be for the ultra-rich. But assuming the economics work out and reusability brings the cost of going to space down, I could see going to space as being kind of like a bucket list thing by the year 2100, you know? Something really expensive, but not out of reach for most people, with dozens of space stations where people can live and work, maybe even media studios. The interesting engineering article also says that a space elevator could be developed as soon as the 2050s, and not just 1, but 3 located along the equator. Okay, I covered space elevators on here a long time ago, and I of course love the idea. I think it would be amazing, but I've got to be honest, the more time has progressed, the less bullish I am on the idea, the less convinced I am that it'll actually happen. I don't want to derail this whole video into going into why, but let's just say that I think that by 2100, the cost of going to space, of space flight, will have calmed down enough that building and constructing and the risk around a space elevator would just kind of be redundant. And I'm not saying it won't happen, but I do put the probabilities fairly low. The article also says that we'll have permanent settlements on the moon and Mars by 2100. And, okay, I know I'm probably sounding really negative compared to this article right now, but I do think that if we have settlements on both of those places, that they'll still be really small, even by 2100. It's not that I don't think we can do it. It's really one of those more, we'll be technically capable of doing this, but I don't know if the economics will work out. You know, like, I think we'll have landed on Mars by 2100, but again, it's the economics of it that I could see not working out. For both Mars and the moon, I think that if we don't find some kind of economic benefit, it will struggle, and it will take way longer than we think it should. If we do find some kind of resource that we could exploit at a profit, then absolutely, we'll be all over both places. But if not, I think by 2100, they might look at the Mars missions the way we look at Apollo, you know, as this amazing inspirational thing that we did that time. So to sum all this up, being fairly conservative, I think that by 2100, people will be shuttling back and forth to the space stations on a regular basis, maybe weekly, with multiple, probably dozens of space stations and hundreds of people living in space at a time. But it's still not something that just anybody can afford to do. And I think that we'll have small outposts on Mars and the moon. And I think that manufacturing will be a big business in space. But back on Earth, the UN predicts that the world's population could reach 10.8 billion by 2100. And of course, this brings up concerns around resources, which is understandable, but I think, and bear with me on this, that the big anxiety people are going to have in the year 2100 around the population is that it's not growing enough. I know, just let me explain. If you look at this chart from the UN Population Division, you can see that most experts predict the birth rate to decline and population to level off in the 2070s and 2080s. This is because as more people get access to advanced medicine, birth rates will go down because people have access to birth control and family planning. So it's expected that by the time 2100 comes around, growth rate will actually be in the negative. And that sounds like a good thing, again, because of limited resources and whatnot. But economically, there's that word again, It's kind of bad. Because when you have fewer people entering the workforce, supporting a larger aging population, it puts some serious constraints on the economy. That's something Japan's dealing with right now. In fact, in September of last year, CNN quoted Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida saying that Japan is, quote, on the brink of not being able to maintain social functions. Like, some people talk about the prospect of a population decline in almost doomsday terms, like global economic collapse. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but I do know that when the growth hits zero, it will be the very first time in the history of our species, outside of weird genetic bottlenecks that we still don't understand, that the population has gone down on this planet. It will be a very big deal. But Joe, you may be saying, you keep talking about how the economics of this and that won't work out. Well, what if we're on a completely different economic model by that point, like some kind of post-scarcity society? Sure, let's talk about that! If you subscribe to the generational theory like I talked about in my video on accelerationism, then you believe that history works in cycles of big crisis periods every 80 years or so, one of which we are approaching, if not in, right now. Which would mean that 2100 would be the next crisis point. Now, whether or not you believe in this theory, and I do have my criticisms of it, you have to admit that capitalism does have a pattern of blowing itself up. I mean, during the Industrial Revolution, capitalism was completely out of control. Working conditions were dangerous, people lived in company towns that gouged them to the point that they would be permanently indebted to the company. Striking workers were mowed down in the streets by the National Guard. People were living in some of the worst conditions in human history. And yeah, there was a backlash. It was called communism. And today we're living in what a lot of people call late-stage capitalism, where once again, everything feels unsustainable, and I could imagine seeing some kind of backlash in the next 20 years or so. Now, what that looks like is anyone's guess. In the US, we didn't fall to communism, but we did bust up monopolies, strengthen unions, and enacted social reforms during that time. So it's possible we may go through some kind of phase like that again, but I don't know if we actually create a new post-capitalist economy. Not yet. But toward the second half of the century, I see, autonomous robotics really starting to have a very real effect on employment, and at the very same time that the world population is leveling off. And this is when I think they really are going to have to come up with something completely different. So my bet is that in the last couple of decades before the end of the century, there will need to be some kind of entirely new economic model of some kind. Maybe digital currencies and credit systems? I don't know. But it's going to be difficult. Okay, a couple of quick angles. Let's talk about energy. Yes, I think we will crack nuclear fusion by then. And so does futurologist Ian Pearson. As Pearson said in a BBC.com article in 2012, quote, "This is likely by 2045 to 2050 and almost certain by 2100. It's widely predicted that we will achieve this. What difference it makes will depend on what other energy technologies we have. We might also see a growth in shale gas or massive solar energy facilities. I don't think that wind power will still be around." What's wrong with wind, Ian? So I do think we'll have wind. But when it comes to fusion, again, it's the economics of it I'm not sure about. I mean, if the only way to do it is by building a $20 billion reactor and solar and battery storage continues to get cheaper, it's going to make a lot more sense for people to just do that. Hell, we might be able to do space solar capture and then bounce it down to stations on Earth with microwave beams for baseload power. That might actually be cheaper than doing fusion at that point. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs estimates that renewables could make up 65% of the energy sector by 2030 and go up to 90% by 2050. Now that sounds pretty aggressive to me, but definitely the general trend is toward renewables more than fossil fuels, and I'm pretty sure that fossil fuels will be more niche in 2100 if they're being used at all. In 2100, the average lifespan should be well into the 80s, and we may even be able to extend life to 130 years, at least according to some medical predictions I found. Which, by the way, will only add to the population decline problem. I like the idea that we could have bespoke treatments where a doctor just diagnoses your problem and then through some gene editing and protein folding, a machine can just create a treatment specific for your condition. Or if aging is caused by epigenetic damage to your genome, maybe a doctor can just pull out your genome, essentially clean it up with CRISPR, and then just put it back into you with a viral vector, and then just undo all the aging damage you've accumulated. And the big question, of course, is will we cure cancer? And yes, I think we will cure most of them at least. Keeping in mind, of course, that cancer is not just one disease, it's actually dozens of different kinds of disease, and we're actually curing new kinds of cancer all the time. So hopefully by then we'll have most of them licked. And the last lens that we can look at the future through, I've saved to the end because depending on how this one goes, it could invalidate every single thing I've said in this video. All right, do I think that we'll reach AGI by the year 2100? Yes, I do. In fact, I think it'll happen before 2050. And some of you may think that even that is absurdly conservative considering the pace of change over the last few years, and you might be right, but I'm thinking it might be kind of like what we're seeing in autonomous cars, that going from 99.9 to 100% is harder than getting from 1 to 99.9%. So to get to where your computer or your phone is having the exact same mental capabilities as a human being, that could be a literal partner with you, I'm thinking that could take some time. Next question, do I think that artificial superintelligence will be a thing by 2100? Yes, I do, and I think it'll happen pretty quickly after AGI happens. And if it does happen, well, this is where all my predictions break down, because it's anyone's guess at that point. What a superintelligent AI could think of is literally, like, by definition, outside our ability to comprehend. It's simultaneously like a god and like an alien life form. Like, maybe we can have cheap fusion power because the AI figured it out. Maybe we can build space elevators and colonize the solar system and have flying cars and cure cancer and fix the economy, and all the things that I had objections to in this video could be figured out by this omniscient being who just takes care of us while we just become, like, I don't know, pets. Or it could completely wipe us out. I'm just saying it could go in different directions. Now, you might be wondering how I went this whole video without mentioning climate change. And yeah, it's been hard. Because when you search for predictions about the year 2100, almost all of them are about climate change. But I didn't want to focus on that because while yes, climate change is definitely going to change a lot of things in the world, I mostly wanted to focus on how people will live in the year 2100. And depending on where you live, your daily life might not be that different at all, or it might be a lot worse. Some places it might actually be better. Just for some fun numbers, though, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that the global temperature would rise by 3.3 to 5.7 Celsius by the end of this century. Sea levels may also rise up to 1.8 meters. This could affect cities like Amsterdam, Bangkok, Dubai, and New Orleans, among many others. Also, annual rainfall may increase by 6.8% by 2100 compared with the period from 1995 to 2014. And carbon dioxide is predicted to reach 560 parts per million by 2100, according to Business Insider. That could destroy more than 9,000 coral reefs around the world. I think we'll continue to see stronger storms and more damaging hurricane seasons, which will affect how and where people live, and we'll see massive migrations of climate refugees around the world. There will be adjustments. But as the trend for electrification continues over the next 30 to 40 years, along with mitigation efforts, I think we might see a plateauing in CO2 levels as well, which could stabilize and trend back downward over time. Unless we hit some kind of tipping point beyond which the Earth can't recover, in which case we as a species will just have to adjust. Maybe with a little help from our godlike superintelligence. So there are a lot of maybes, coulds, and mights in this episode, because predicting the future is impossible. Nobody knows how things will go, and there's always the possibility some crazy, unimaginable, disruptive event that can change the course of human history. And that course is not yet written, because we're the authors, and it's our job to write it. I know it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time. Most of the time we feel like we don't really have any control over the things that happen in the world, but we actually do. In the choices we make, and the people we surround ourselves with, how we spend our money, every single decision we make writes another letter in the grand choose your own adventure book of the future. There's a million different possible future timelines, so my advice would be pick one you like and start working toward it. And one way you can do that is to get your money in order, which, by the way, $1 today is predicted to have the same buying power as $8.64 in 2100, because inflation and all that. So you better hang on to as much of it as possible, and I might suggest, to help you out with that, Rocket Money. Did you know most people are paying for a subscription of some kind, they don't even know it? That's why everything's going to subscriptions these days, because you're a lot more likely to just forget about it and just keep paying on accident. They aren't doing it because they're making less money off of you. Well, Rocket Money keeps an eye on your account and finds recurring payments like that and makes them visible to you, and they'll cancel any subscriptions you decide you don't need. And this works. I know this works because I found out that I'm paying twice for HBO Max somehow. I was probably doing that for well over a year. Rocket Money found out about it in like 5 minutes. And that's just the start of what Rocket Money can do. They can also set budgets based on analysis of your spending habits. You can set up automatic savings deposits so you can grow a cushion over time without having to think about it. And they can even look at your bills and negotiate better rates for you. It's like having an automated chief financial officer for your life that deals with these things so you don't have to. Rocket Money customers save an average of $720 a year, and altogether they saved over $500 million. And you can save too, so join the over 5 million members using Rocket Money today by going to rocketmoney.com/joescott or click the link in the description. It costs nothing to start, you can give it a try, and there are features that you can unlock with premium subscription, but it is free to get started. So one more time, that's rocketmoney.com/joescott to get started for free. It's down in the description, go check it out. All right, big thanks for watching, and a huge shout out to the Answer Files on Patreon who have been supporting this channel, some of them for like 7 years now, which is just crazy. But I can't thank you guys enough. You keep things going. You give a nice cushion so I don't ever have to like worry too much about not being able to pay my team or pay the bills and stuff. Can't thank you enough. But there's some new people I need to shout out. We've got Dave Schminicki, Gail McQueen, Richard Williams, Krista Morgan, Nina Lynn, Peter Antill, Dennis Botel, Marcus Stubbles, Marina Stanfa, John Donnelly, and Lucy. Some of these guys supported a while back, so it's taken a while for me to get to these because of the holidays and everything. But thank you guys so much. If you would like to join them, get early access to videos, access to exclusive live streams and Zoom calls, as well as join a community of amazing people, just go to patreon.com/answerswithjoe. Please do share and like this video if you did like it, and if this is your first time here and you have no idea who this guy is who talked for however God knows how long this video is, and you want to know more about the stuff that I talk about, you can look at any of them that are down on the little sidebar of this thing if you're in your browser, or should have a thing pop up on screen right here that you could go check out, and I invite you to do so. And if you enjoy it and want to see more, I do invite you to subscribe. Come back with videos every Monday. But I think that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, rest of the century for that matter. Stay safe, and I will see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.